Chapters 9 and 10 of Anybody But Anne by Carolyn Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 9. The Inquest. Luncheon was served informally. The members of the household and guests drifted in and out of the dining room, where the footman served them from a buffet. It chanced that I sat down with Morland and Archer. We all said little, but though Morland was quiet, it seemed as though we were endeavoring not to talk, though he really wanted to. "Would you rather we went away?" Archer asked of him. "Perhaps you would prefer not to have any guests at present." "No, no," said Morland a little irritably. "You two fellows stay on, of course. Perhaps you can help me, and Lord knows I need help. As to the ladies, they must do as they choose. Mrs. Stelton wants to remain, but I fear these awful scenes will prove too much for the nerves of Miss Fordyce. She is so highly strung." "These scenes are enough to shake the nerves of anybody," I put in. "And you know, Morland, without being told, that Archer and I stand ready to help you in any way we can. But I confess I can't find anything to do by way of assistance." "Nor I," said Archer. "But if our presence here makes it any easier for you, here we stay as long as you wish. At any rate we can meet some of the visitors, and save you or Mrs. Van Wyck that annoyance." Of course everyone in the village knew of the tragedy by this time, and flocks of curious people were gathering in and about the house. Soon the whole place was in a turmoil. Neighbors and village people were coming and going, and everybody was making suggestions or propounding theories. Barbara and Morland quarreled openly. Anne refused to see anybody. Archer stood around, moody and taciturn. The languid figure of Beth Fordyce could be seen strolling about the gardens, wringing her hands in picturesque despair; while Mrs. Stelton fluttered about everywhere, asking absurd questions and making herself a general nuisance. I longed for a little talk with Anne, but decided not to bother her, so I employed myself answering the questions of the curious visitors who came and went. The whole village was up in arms. And yet nobody seemed to care very much that David Van Wyck was dead. Their all-absorbing interest was the mystery of the thing. They positively gloated over the seemingly contradictory facts that a man had met his death in an inaccessible room, and yet apparently not by his own hand. Dozens of explanations were offered, some ingenious, some ridiculous; but I listened to them all, hoping that perhaps a chance shot might hit the truth. For I, too, was deeply interested in solving the mystery. Quite apart from my personal connection with the matter, I felt a stirring of the detective instinct to solve the problem. And not the least curious phase of it was that apparently nobody accused or even suspected any individual. The whole argument seemed to be that it must have been the work of an expert burglar, and yet that the entrance of such an intruder was impossible. Buttonwood Terrace, hitherto so exclusive, was thrown open to all. Beside the curiosity seekers from the village, many personal friends and some distant relatives arrived at the house. As both Anne and Barbara declined to see anybody, Mrs. Carstairs acted as hostess. She was serene and composed, but with an air of calm determination that made me wonder what her thoughts might be. At one time I saw her in earnest colloquy with Mr. Markham. I burned to know what she was talking about, and I asked him. "Oh," he said, "she doesn't want to testify at the inquest, and she doesn't want her son to, either. But of course they'll have to." "Can he or they be implicated?" I asked with interest. "Probably not. More likely it's a woman's natural instinct to dread such an experience both for herself and for anyone dear to her." I thought then of the peculiar circumstances of Carstairs and his mother both hunting for something in the road, and both denying that they had lost anything. I was about to tell this to Mr. Markham when he was called away on some matter; and I thought, too, perhaps it was better not to mention the subject until I should discover what developments might result from the inquest. Coroner Mellon proved himself capable of conducting matters in a businesslike way. If he appeared hard and heartless, it was probably necessary considering the work he had to do. The inquest was to be held at 2:30, and there was much to be done by way of preparation. The jurymen were arriving, also several policemen and a number of reporters. The incoming trains brought people from the city, and many of the principal men of the village were in attendance. Not everyone was allowed to enter the house, but the grounds were thronged with curiosity seekers and idlers. As the time neared for the inquest, the great hall began to be filled with people. A table had been placed in the center for the use of the coroner and the reporters, and a group of chairs near by were intended for the jury. Seats were reserved for the members of the household, and the rest of the room was quickly filled by an interested if horrified audience. The coroner and the jurymen filed in and took their places, and, as if by the touch of a magic wand, the beautiful reception hall was transformed into a court room. The arrival of the family upon the scene created a decided stir amongst the audience. Anne came first, walking with Condren Archer. Her beautiful face was white, but her eyes were not cast down. Instead, she looked straight ahead of her, but with an unseeing gaze, as if walking in sleep. Archer led her to a chair and sat down beside her. They were followed immediately by Barbara and Morland, who were whispering together as they came in. This brother and sister were often at variance in their opinions, and apparently the present occasion offered them opportunity for differing views. Mrs. Chelton and Miss Fordyce followed them, both looking very much disturbed and embarrassed. I myself came in with Markham, the detective, and behind us were Mrs. Carstairs and her son. The other servants were congregated in a nearby room, but Mrs. Carstairs had insisted on having her son by her side, and it had been allowed. Coroner Mellon was short and sharp in his speech, and wasted little time in preliminaries. His jury was sworn, and his first witness on the stand, almost before I realized that the inquest had begun. The valet, Carstairs, was the first one questioned. He answered the coroner in a nervous and agitated manner, and it was clear to be seen that he was exceedingly ill at ease. To me, however, this was only a natural result of finding himself implicated in such a tragedy. "Tell the story in your own way," said Coroner Mellon, speaking a little more kindly, as he observed the man's demeanor. "I went to the master's room this morning, sir, as I always do, and he wasn't there, and his bed hadn't been slept in. So, as I couldn't think of any place he might be except in his study, I went there, sir, and it was locked, and I couldn't get in. I knocked several times, but nobody answered, so I went and told Jeanette, and she told Mrs. Van Wyck." "Who is Jeanette?" asked Mr. Mellon. "She's Mrs. Van Wyck's maid, sir. And then the gentlemen came from the dining room, and they ordered the door broken in, sir. We called Ranney for that." "Never mind about that now. Tell us of last evening. When did you see Mr. Van Wyck last?" "When he was dressing for dinner, sir. And he told me then that I needn't attend him when he retired. He said he expected some visitors in the evening, and as he should be up late I needn't wait up for him." "And didn't you?" "No, sir." "Why did you hesitate at that reply?" I didn't, sir." "You did. What time did you go to bed yourself last night?" At about midnight, sir." "And where were you all the evening?" "I was down in the village. I went to a ball there." "And returned home about midnight?" "Why, yes, sir." The valet did seem disingenuous, and I felt sure that the coroner doubted his truthfulness. But to my mind the man was merely confused by the questions shot at him. During the examination Mrs. Carstairs sat looking at her son. Her hands were clasped in the intensity of her attention, and I could see that she was controlling her agitation by sheer force of will. I had no reason to think the valet had killed his master, but I couldn't help surmising that either he or his mother or both knew something of the mystery that the others did not. I saw the coroner about to dismiss the witness, and I scribbled a hasty line and passed it to Mr. Mellon, advising him to ask the valet further questions about the evening before. The coroner seemed a little at sea in the matter, but he followed my advice. "Did you see any of the members of the household on your return last night?" No, sir." Either the man was actually scared out of his wits, or he was concealing something; for a more stammering, frightened witness I never saw. "Are you sure of this?" An affirmative nod was the only answer, and the valet's fingers laced and interlaced until I feared he would injure them. "The servants, did you see any of them?" "Why, yes, sir," and Carstairs' eyes rolled wildly as though he had made a terrifying admission. "Which ones?" "Only Jeanette, sir." "Where did you see her?" "In the servants' dining room, sir." "What was she doing there at midnight?" "She was about to go to attend on Mrs. Van Wyck, sir." I saw Jeanette's white face peeping in from the next room, and she looked about as terrified as the valet himself. In an undertone, I drew Mr. Markham's attention to this fact, but he seemed to think it unimportant, and said that servants were always rattled at being made publicly conspicuous. I didn't entirely agree with him, and I felt fully convinced that Carstairs and Jeanette had knowledge of some sort bearing on the tragedy. I glanced at Anne and found that she, like Mrs. Carstairs, was simply holding herself together by strong will power. The others were not so deeply affected. The Van Wyck brother and sister were quiet and composed, though Morland had that same effect of being ready to break out indignantly at any moment. Mrs. Stelton was frankly interested in the proceedings, and showed it in her eager countenance; but Miss Fordyce sat with closed eyes, as if overcome by the whole affair. Archer looked grave, but as he continually glanced toward Anne, I was certain that he felt even more solicitude for her well-being than for the developments of the case. Apparently the coroner thought the valet's evidence not of crucial importance, for he concluded by saying, "Did you see any of the members of the household on your return?" "None but the servant, sir." "You didn't see Mr. Van Wyck in his room or in his study?" "No, sir, I did not." This answer at least was given without hesitation, and apparently satisfied, the coroner dismissed the witness. Ranney, the garage mechanician, was next called. His testimony was straightforward, and he was entirely unembarrassed, and indeed seemed almost uninterested. "Mr. Morland called me," he said, "and ordered me to pick the lock of the study door. Of course, with my knowledge of mechanics, I could do this; and as it was then bolted, he ordered me to saw out the piece of wood containing the bolt. This I did, and we opened the door." "You live in the house?" asked Mr. Mallon. "No, sir. I live in a cottage near the stables and garage." "What time did you retire last night?" "Early, sir. Between 9 and 10 o'clock." "Were you awake at or about midnight?" Before replying, Ranney gave a long, steady glance at Carstairs. The valet returned it with a belligerent stare that seemed to convey a threat. I was surprised at the directness of this glance after Carstairs' exhibition of nervousness. Apparently it was entirely intelligible to Ranney, for he set his jaw with grim determination, and proceeded to answer the coroner. "I was wakeful on and off all night, sir. I can't say as I was awake at 12 o'clock, and I can't say as I wasn't. I'm a light sleeper, sir." "Then you would have heard if anything unusual was taking place?" "Do you mean here at the house, sir? Because my cottage is too far away for me to hear burglars or anything like that." "Did you hear or see anything unusual at any time during the night?" Again Ranney hesitated, again he looked at Carstairs, this time including Mrs. Carstairs in his glance. To my surprise, while the valet still had a threatening aspect, his mother smiled slightly at Ranney. It was a strange smile, a little coaxing and of a persuasive charm. I don't know whether anyone else noticed this by-play, and the detective paid no attention to it whatever, but it interested me; and I thoroughly believe that it was in response to Mrs. Carstairs' beseeching glance that Ranney said firmly, "No, sir. Nothing did I hear or see all night long." I didn't believe him. To me it was a palpable untruth, but I saw a quiet smile of satisfaction on Mrs. Carstairs' face, and a victorious gleam in the eyes of her son. What it all meant I didn't know, and I began to think perhaps I was making too much of it, when suddenly I remembered Miss Fordyce's account of the motor car, and the man she had seen from her window. Could Ranney or Carstairs know anything about this, and did it bear on the mystery? I glanced at Miss Fordyce, but she still sat with closed eyes and looked like one in a trance. I doubted if she had even heard Ranney's evidence, or that of the valet. But I argued to myself that it would be wiser for me to say nothing, and wait until the testimony of Miss Fordyce should be called for; when she would have to tell about the motor car, and I could then see if either of these servants showed any guilty knowledge. Next came the evidence of the doctor. He deposed that he had been the Van Wyck family physician for a great many years. He told of being called that morning to Buttonwood Terrace, and of his seeing the body of David Van Wyck. It was his opinion, after examination, that Mr. Van Wyck's death occurred about midnight. "From what cause?" asked the coroner. "I frankly admit," said Dr. Mason, that I am puzzled as to the instrument which caused Mr. Van Wyck's death. I have made an examination of the body, and I find no bullet or shot. I conclude, therefore, that he was stabbed with some sharp pointed instrument which has left a small circular hole in the clothing and the flesh." "Could it have been a hat pin?" asked the coroner. "No, it could not," declared the doctor, a little shortly. "I don't know why people are so ready to assume a hat pin. As a matter of fact, a hat pin is a most impracticable weapon. It would either bend double or break off if used for such a purpose. Nor was it a dagger of any usual description. A dagger or a knife would leave a slit-like incision, and the mark in question is absolutely circular. I can only say that the weapon must have been sharp-pointed and round. Further than that I do not know." "Could the wound have been self-inflicted?" asked the coroner. "So far as its position is concerned, yes. But it is improbable that a man could have sufficient force of nerve to stab himself in that manner, for it meant a sure strong drive of the weapon. Also it is improbable that after that thrust the victim could live long enough to draw out the weapon and hide or dispose of it. And I understand it has not been found." "No," returned Mr. Mellen, "it has not yet been found, but it may be eventually discovered. It is your opinion, then, Dr. Mason, that David Van Wyck was not a suicide?" "That is my opinion," returned Dr. Mason positively. 10. Further Evidence. Next came Barclay Lassiter, the secretary. "Your name and position?" asked the coroner curtly. For some reason the young man showed rather a defiant attitude. "I am Barclay Lassiter, and my position was that of secretary to David Van Wyck." "Confidential secretary?" "Yes, private and confidential secretary." "For how long have you held that position?" "A little over a year." "What are your duties?" "My duties have been to do whatever Mr. Van Wyck required of me in the way of attention to his correspondence and business affairs." "You live here?" "No, I board in the village. But frequently, at Mr. Van Wyck's request, I've stayed here overnight, or for a few days at a time." "When were you last with Mr. Van Wyck?" "Last evening, when a committee of 3 gentlemen visited him in his study." "For what purpose?" "It was Mr. Van Wyck's intention to make a gift of nearly $1 million for a village library, and 3 prominent men of the village were a committee to accept this gift and superintend its disposal as directed." This evidence caused a decided sensation in the audience. The library plan had been a secret until now, and the village people were astounded at the news. The coroner went on. "As confidential secretary, you must know all about the details of this plan for the library." "I only know that it was Mr. Van Wyck's positive intention to make the gift. Papers were drawn up to that effect last evening, but they were not completed, and not signed." "And those papers have been stolen?" "They have disappeared." "Meaning that Mr. Van Wyck may have disposed of them himself before he died?" "Meaning nothing, but that the papers are missing, and I have no way of ascertaining whether they were stolen or not." "And the Van Wyck pearls, they are also missing?" "They are." "They were always kept in the safe?" "Not always, but usually." "When not in the safe, where were they?" "In the possession of Mrs. Van Wyck." "Did she prefer to keep them in her own possession?" This question seemed to me too personal, and I noticed both Archer and Morland showed frowning faces at the coroner's words. But Lassiter answered decidedly. "She certainly did. The possession of the pearls was a constant source of disagreement between them." This roused me to extreme indignation, but as I looked at Anne, and saw the calm, even supercilious expression on her face, I concluded I was too sensitive in the matter, and probably it was necessary that these things should come out in the evidence. I knew David Van Wyck's disposition, and it was not at all astonishing that he and Anne should have quarreled about the pearls. I knew they were hers in the sense that he had given them to her; but I knew, too, that he claimed the ownership of all and any of her property. However, it was very ungracious of Lassiter to volunteer the information as to marital disagreements. "When did you last see Mr. Van Wyck alive?" Mr. Mellen next inquired of the witness. "I was present at his conference with the committee." Those gentlemen stayed until well after 11. I then remained with Mr. Van Wyck until very nearly 12, leaving for home, I should say, at about 10 minutes before midnight." "You left Mr. Van Wyck's study and went directly to your home?" "I did," returned Lassiter, and though the answer was prompt, there was something about the man's voice that made me doubt his integrity. I had no reason to question the truth of his statement, but his wandering eye, a certain nervous working of his features, and his restless clasping and unclasping of his hands made me wonder whether or not he had anything to conceal. But I also realized that the curt, almost aggressive manner of Coroner Mellon was enough to disturb the poise of the most innocent witness. "You left Mr. Van Wyck alone in his study?" "Not so. His son Morland was with him." "I was not," declared Morland, starting up from his seat not far from me. Lassiter paid no attention to this interruption, and the coroner said: "Why does Mr. Morland Van Wyck contradict you, Mr. Lassiter?" "I don't know," said the secretary. "I repeat that when I left the study I left Mr. Van Wyck and his son there, and I said good night to both as I went out of the door." "Did they respond to your good night?" "The elder Mr. Van Wyck said, 'Good night, Lassiter,' in his off-hand way, and immediately followed it with a remark to his son." "What was the remark?" "He said, 'You see, Morland, I have proved that I could carry out my intention after all.'" "And did Mr. Morland Van Wyck reply to this?" "That I cannot say, as I was by that time outside the door and had closed it behind me." "And you know nothing more of this matter?" "The next time I saw Mr. Van Wyck was when I arrived here this morning and found him dead." "You are positive that when you left last night Mr. Morland Van Wyck was in the study with his father?" "I am positive." There was a breathless silence. It was quite evident from the expressions on the faces of the audience that they had leaped to the conclusion that Morland Van Wyck had killed his father because of the plan for endowing a library. The villagers had become aware of the situation so suddenly, and had been so astonished at the munificence of the gift, that it seemed to them but natural that the Van Wyck family should resent this disposal of a fortune. But the thought of Morland committing a crime because of it appalled them, and looks of horror could be seen on every face. Morland Van Wyck was next called as a witness. The sight of his livid, angry face seemed to render the coroner incapable of definite questions. "What have you to say for yourself?" he said. "I have this to say," thundered Morland. "Barclay Lassiter lies when he says he left me with my father. The truth is, I left the study before Lassiter did. I left him there with my father, and if he states the contrary, he has his own reason for doing so." "You are implying—" began the coroner. "I'm implying nothing," Morland stormed on. "I am stating that I left my father and his secretary alone in the study, and I am stating nothing but that." He threw a defiant look at the secretary, who returned it in kind. Coroner Mellon was decidedly nonplussed. He seemed to fear an outbreak of personal hostilities between these two, and he said hastily: "Let us not pursue this further. One of you gentlemen must be mistaken. Mr. Van Wyck, have you any opinion or theory as to the cause of your father's death?" I thought this rather clever of the coroner, for it would bring forth either an accusation of the secretary, or a tacit implication of freedom from suspicion. "My opinion is the only one possible to hold. My father was murdered by some evil-minded intruder, presumably an expert burglar, because valuable jewels and valuable papers have been stolen. But how, in your opinion, could this intruder commit his crimes and get away, leaving the room securely locked and bolted on the inside, with no possible means of ingress or egress?" "I'm not prepared to say how he did it. The fact remains that he did do it." At this point a juryman made a remark. He was a shrewd-faced young fellow, and seemed imbued with a sense of his own importance. "I wish to say," he began, "that we should like at least a suggestion as to how the murderer could have escaped from a room which we may call hermetically sealed." Morland turned on him with an impatient gesture. "I hate that term, hermetically sealed. It is absurd, to begin with. That my father's murderer did get out of the room is proved by the fact that the instrument of death cannot be found. Therefore, since the murderer did get out, the room cannot be hermetically sealed, however much it may appear so." "Can there be any secret or concealed entrance?" asked the alert juryman. "No," replied Morland. "There is nothing of that sort in the house. And the study is really a separate building, only attached at one corner. Moreover, a burglar, however enterprising, could hardly know of a secret entrance of which we did not know ourselves. I tell you, Mr. Coroner, the murderer got away after the clever fashion of a cracksman who knows his business. How he did it I cannot tell you, but he killed my father, stole the Van Wyck pearls, stole also the deed of gift which had been drawn up for the village library, and then escaped. Escaped, Mr. Coroner, and is therefore still at large. But he must be found, and no effort must be spared to find him." I looked at Morland in astonishment. He had assumed a rather pompous attitude and seemed to be giving orders instead of giving evidence. Coroner Mellon looked greatly disturbed. I felt sure that he was beginning to realize that the case was more than he could cope with. His limited intelligence could not grapple with the mysteries and contradictions that confronted him. Also, he began to realize that Morland had a high temper, and that if aggravated much further he might create an unpleasant scene. "We are even now using our best efforts to discover the criminal, Mr. Van Wyck," Mr. Mellon went on, "and I count upon you for assistance in the matter." "How can I assist you?" Morland blazed. "If I knew anything at all about the matter, I should volunteer the information without having it dragged out of me. You must hold your inquest, of course, but it will tell you nothing, for the problem is too deep and too mysterious to be solved easily. We have engaged a detective in whom I have confidence, but the truth cannot be learned by questioning witnesses. However, Mr. Coroner, proceed with your duties, and get them over as soon as may be." "That is what I am doing," said Mr. Mellon, with a sudden accession of dignity. "And in order to proceed properly, I must insist upon asking you some further questions, even at the risk of being considered personal. Were you on good terms with your father at the time of his death?" "What?" thundered Morland. "Of course I was. I have never been on anything but good terms with my father. To be sure we've had differences of opinion, and we never hesitated to state plainly our views to each other, but I don't call that being on bad terms with him. In case of a disagreement we fought it out as man to man. Naturally I objected to his foolish plan of founding a library of proportions and values altogether too great for a tiny village like Crescent Falls. Naturally I told him so. As he was very determined in the matter we had high words on various occasions, and last night matters came to a climax." "What do you mean by came to a climax?" The coroner fairly pounced on this phrase. "I mean what I say. The climax of my father's plan was reached when he called the committee men to meet him and accept his absurd gift. I do not blame these gentlemen. They would have been foolish, indeed, to refuse a gift so freely offered to them. I was present myself at the interview, and I used every argument I could think of to dissuade my father from his project. But I think I may say, and I think the gentlemen of the committee will bear me out on this, that every objection I raised only made my father more determined to have his own way." The three men who had represented the committee were all present, and they nodded their heads in confirmation of Morland's statement. I looked at Morland thoughtfully. At one moment I would feel convinced that he was really a good son, and that it was beyond belief that he should have raised his hand against his own father. And then I realized his ungovernable temper and his uncontrollable fits of passion, and knowing that last night had been indeed the climax of the whole subject, I wondered if a sudden spasm of passion could have made Morland so beside himself with rage that he was almost irresponsible, and had in a frenzy committed the awful deed. And then rose in my mind the old question: even supposing he had, how did he get out of the locked room? It seemed to me that the theory of murder was impossible, unless we could discover some means of exit from that sealed study. Mr. Mellon looked very much perturbed. He seemed unwilling to accuse Morland, and he had no evidence whatever against him. There was a breathless silence in the room, and I could not blind myself to the fact that there was a hostile atmosphere toward young Van Wyck. It was quite evident, too, that he noticed this himself, and assumed a defiant air in consequence. His whole nature was touchy, and it was characteristic of him to show bravado when an accusation was even implied. Coroner Mellon looked at him intently, and seemed uncertain what to do next. But he must proceed, and so, with a baffled air, he dismissed Morland and called Barbara Van Wyck. The girl took the stand with no apparent trepidation, and calmly awaited questioning. "What can you tell us of this affair?" asked the coroner briefly. "I can tell you no facts that you do not already know," returned Barbara, in even tones and with perfect poise of manner. "But I wish to advance a theory totally different from my brother's. To repeat the phrase already used, my father's study was hermetically sealed. It was impossible for an intruder to get in and out again, leaving the room as we found it this morning. I myself examined the windows and doors, and I assure you that not only are the locks and bolts especially strong, but they are so complicated as to make it impossible to manipulate them from the outside. I hold, therefore, that my father was not murdered, but that he took his own life." "And the robberies?" suggested the coroner. "There were no robberies. The pearls have disappeared, but I am positive that my father hid them, and that they will yet be discovered. The deed of gift he doubtless destroyed himself, and then took his own life. My father was a very eccentric man, and it is my opinion that at the last his brain gave way, and for what he did he was not mentally or morally responsible." There was something in the girl's words and manner that carried conviction. Her quiet, dignified composure was so different from Morland's belligerent insistence that the sympathy of all present seemed to go out to her. All over the room heads were nodding approval of her theory, and it seemed quite in keeping with the erratic career of David Van Wyck. "But, Miss Van Wyck," said the coroner, and he seemed to speak with a certain diffidence, "if your theory is right, what became of the weapon used by your father?" "I do not know, nor do I know what that weapon could have been. But I hold that that may yet be discovered, and I hold, too, that the absence of that weapon is not so inexplicable a mystery as is the question of how a burglar could escape from that room." This was true so far as it went. We were confronted by two seeming impossibilities. If a suicide, the weapon could not have disappeared. If a murder, the murderer could not have made his exit from that sealed room. As theories, one might take one's choice. "You think, then," Mr. Mallon was saying, "the missing pearls will yet be found?" "I do not know," replied Barbara. "I think that my father hid them with the unnatural cunning of a diseased mind. For I am perfectly certain that my father was not sane when he took his own life. And if the same ingenuity which marked the manner of his death prompted his hiding of the pearls, it may well be possible that we shall never find them." I looked at Miss Van Wyck in amazement. The girl I had thought so colourless and inane was proving possessed of an unsuspected strength of character. Her simple, logical statements carried a great weight, and though she left unsolved a principal point, many of her listeners showed a decided willingness to subscribe to her theories. End of chapters 9 and 10.